The hall at Harvard University was bright with lights and full of people. Rows of wooden chairs stretched across the large room, and every seat was taken. Professors, graduate students, and visiting scholars sat with notebooks in their laps. Some leaned forward with excitement. Others whispered quietly while waiting for the lecture to begin. The air buzzed with a mix of curiosity and pride, because the speaker that evening was one of the most respected professors of mathematics. He was known across the world for solving some of the most difficult problems in modern history. When he stepped onto the stage, the crowd broke into polite applause. His gray suit, polished shoes, and calm voice carried the weight of decades of experience. He greeted the audience warmly and began his talk with a smile. "Today," he said, "we are going to explore a problem that has fascinated and frustrated mathematicians for years." He wrote a long equation on the chalkboard, filling it with numbers, symbols, and letters. The chalk squeaked and the lines looked almost like an art piece rather than mathematics. When he stepped back, he dusted his hands and pointed toward the board. "This," he said, "is a problem that cannot be solved. It is in fact impossible." The room fell quiet. Some nodded respectfully, believing the professor's words without question. Others scribbled notes, eager to capture every detail. They trusted his authority. After all, if someone of his brilliance said it was impossible, then surely it must be so. A few students exchanged knowing looks, the kind that carried agreement. This was another mystery of mathematics that would remain unsolved for now. In the very last row of the hall, almost hidden among tall college students, sat a boy who looked very different from the rest. He was only 9 years old. His small feet barely touched the floor, and his legs swung slightly as he sat. He wore a simple shirt and sneakers, and he clutched a small notebook in his hands. His older sister, who studied at Harvard, had brought him along because she didn't want to leave him alone at home. She thought he might get bored during the lecture, but she had been surprised by how attentive he looked from the very beginning. The boy's dark eyes were fixed on the chalkboard. Unlike the others in the room, he didn't see something impossible. He saw shapes, patterns, and hidden clues in the way the symbols lined up. To him, numbers weren't frightening or frustrating. They were like puzzles, games he had been playing since before he even started school. Where others saw walls, he saw doors waiting to be opened. He tilted his head slightly, his lips moving as if whispering the numbers to himself. His sister leaned toward him and whispered, "Are you okay? Do you want to draw in your notebook instead?" But he shook his head without looking away from the board. A faint smile played on his lips. "It's not impossible," he murmured softly. She frowned. "Shh, don't say that out loud," she warned gently. "This is Harvard. Everyone here is very serious." But the boy could not stop staring at the equation. His little mind was already working, turning the numbers around, rearranging them like puzzle pieces. While the professor continued speaking, explaining why scholars had failed, the boy scribbled in his notebook. His handwriting was messy, but his numbers flowed quickly, each step connected to the next. His sister glanced at the page and widened her eyes. She recognized the same equation from the board, but what startled her more was that her little brother seemed to be doing something with it, something bold, something she couldn't even begin to understand. On stage, the professor's voice carried confidence. He spoke about the many attempts by great mathematicians who had tried to solve this problem. He explained why each of them had failed, why the limits of logic and proof always broke down at a certain point. The audience listened carefully, and many nodded again in agreement. His final words before pausing were strong. "This is a problem beyond solution. It is not just difficult, it is impossible." The applause that followed was respectful but not overly loud. Everyone in the hall understood the weight of what had just been said. But in the back row, the boy tightened his grip on his notebook. His little face was serious now, and he leaned closer to his sister. "I know how to fix it," he whispered. She shook her head in disbelief. "Don't joke. This isn't a classroom riddle. This is real math," but he didn't laugh. His eyes stayed fixed on the chalkboard. When the professor asked if anyone had questions, a few graduate students raised their hands. They asked about theories, about history, about the logic behind the impossibility. The professor answered with patience, moving slowly across the stage. Then a small, clear voice rose from the very back of the room. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said, standing on his chair so he could be seen. His voice was not loud, but the silence in the room made it carry far. "I think I can solve it." The hall froze. For a moment, no one spoke. Heads turned in the boy's direction. Some people laughed softly, thinking it was a child's innocent imagination. A few students rolled their eyes. The professor looked up in surprise, then smiled kindly, assuming the boy was just being playful. "Young man," he said with gentle humor, "this is one of the hardest problems in mathematics. Even my brightest students cannot solve it. It's impossible." But the boy did not sit down. His small hands clutched the notebook tightly. His heart beat faster, but his voice stayed steady. "Please," he said, "let me try." The professor looked at him for a long moment. The audience waited, curious about what would happen next. Finally, the professor chuckled lightly. "Very well," he said. "Come forward, young man. Show us what you see." His tone was half amused, half intrigued, as though he expected the boy to draw something silly on the board. But deep down there was a spark of curiosity in his eyes. The boy's sister gasped softly and tried to stop him, but it was too late. He had already started walking down the aisle, his small figure moving past rows of tall, serious students. Some whispered, others smirked, but all of them kept watching. The boy's sneakers echoed softly against the wooden floor as he approached the chalkboard. He was small, almost too small for the moment, but his steps were steady. When he reached the front, the professor handed him a piece of chalk. The boy's hands were tiny, the chalk almost too big, but he held it firmly. He climbed onto a small stool to reach the board. The audience leaned forward, curious, doubtful, and amused. The professor crossed his arms, still smiling faintly, waiting to see what the child would do. The boy turned to the chalkboard, his eyes shining with focus. For him, this was not about showing off or proving someone wrong. It was about finishing a puzzle that had been calling to him since the lecture began. He placed the chalk against the board and began to write. The boy's hand moved quickly across his notebook, his pencil scratching against the paper while the rest of the audience was focused on the professor's lecture. He was only 9 years old, yet his mind worked in a rhythm of its own. To him, the long rows of numbers and symbols on the chalkboard weren't a barrier, they were an invitation. Each line whispered clues like pieces of a giant jigsaw puzzle that no one else could see fitting together. His eyes sparkled with curiosity and he kept muttering numbers under his breath, adjusting his steps, correcting himself, then going forward again. The professor continued to explain to the hall why this particular problem was impossible to solve. He said that great mathematicians from around the world had attempted it. He told the audience about conferences where brilliant minds had debated over it for hours, only to end up with silence and disappointment. He reminded them that sometimes in science and mathematics, it was important to accept limitations. "There are boundaries to what we know," he said firmly, tapping the chalk against the board. "And this problem represents one of those boundaries. To cross it is to step into the impossible." The crowd seemed convinced. They respected his authority. Many of the graduate students scribbled notes eagerly, hoping to recall his words later for their own research. Some even felt relieved, as if they didn't have to worry about this difficult problem anymore because their professor had declared it impossible. But the boy in the back row wasn't convinced. His little mind refused to accept limits when he could see possibilities. He leaned toward his sister and whispered again, "It's not impossible. Look, I can do this." His sister shook her head quickly, her eyes darting nervously toward the serious audience around them. "Stop it," she hissed softly. "People will laugh at you. This is not a school quiz. This is Harvard." She tried to pull the notebook from his hands, but he held on tightly, pressing his pencil harder against the page. The boy's handwriting wasn't neat, but the logic in his steps was clear. Each line of his work flowed into the next, building like a staircase toward something bigger. He wasn't distracted by the stares or the authority of the professor on stage. He was lost in the puzzle, chasing the answer with the pure energy of curiosity. When the professor paused and asked if there were any questions, several graduate students raised their hands. They asked about theories that had been attempted before, about why certain approaches collapsed halfway, and about what it meant for future research if the problem could not be solved. The professor answered with patience and authority, his voice steady, his tone calm. He reminded them once again that failure to solve this problem was not a sign of weakness, but a sign of the greatness of mathematics. It showed that there were still mysteries in the world. And then, when the hall was quiet again, the boy's voice rose. It was small but clear, like a bell ringing in silence. "Excuse me, sir," he said, standing up on his chair so he could be seen above the older students. "I think I can solve it." For a second, the entire hall froze. Heads turned one after another like ripples moving across a pond. First, the students nearby looked at him with raised eyebrows. Then the ones farther ahead turned around, and finally, even the professors in the front row glanced back. A low murmur spread through the hall. Some students chuckled, some shook their heads, and a few whispered with surprise. The professor, standing by the chalkboard, looked at the boy with amusement. He raised his eyebrows but smiled kindly, perhaps thinking the child was just being playful. "Young man," he said warmly, "I admire your courage, but this is not a problem that can be solved. Even my best students struggle with it. It's impossible." But the boy didn't sit down. He hugged his notebook tightly and raised his chin. His little voice didn't shake. "Please," he said, "let me try." There was a pause long enough for everyone to feel the tension in the room. Some in the audience whispered to each other, unsure whether to laugh or to feel impressed by the boy's confidence. The professor studied him for a moment, then chuckled gently, deciding it might not hurt to entertain him. "Very well," he said, his voice carrying both humor and curiosity. "Come forward and show us what you have in mind." The boy's sister gasped and tried to pull him back down into his seat. "Stop it, you'll embarrass yourself," she whispered desperately. But he slipped out of her reach, clutching his notebook like a treasure, and started walking down the aisle. His small figure moved slowly past rows of tall, serious students, some smirking, others watching with sharp interest. The hall grew quiet again, as if the audience was preparing for a show. The professor stood back waiting. He expected perhaps a scribble, maybe a child's drawing or some random numbers that would amuse the crowd, but he also felt a spark of curiosity. There was something unusual in the boy's confidence, something that didn't feel like simple childish imagination. The boy's sneakers tapped softly on the wooden floor as he reached the front. He looked up at the chalkboard, then at the professor. The professor handed him a piece of chalk. In the boy's small hand, the chalk looked almost too big, but he gripped it firmly. The professor pointed at the stool near the board, and the boy climbed up carefully, standing tall enough now to reach the wide, clean space on the chalkboard. The room was completely silent. No one coughed, no one whispered. All eyes were on the 9-year-old standing at the front of one of the most respected halls in the world. The professor crossed his arms, smiling faintly, ready to humor him. The graduate students leaned forward, half expecting to laugh, half curious about what he would write. His sister sat frozen in the back row, her hands pressed against her lips. The boy turned toward the chalkboard. He pressed the chalk against the black surface and began to write. His strokes were small but steady. He wrote numbers, symbols, and letters, each one flowing into the next as if he had rehearsed it 100 times. The chalk squeaked softly, and the sound echoed in the silent hall. At first, the audience waited for him to stumble. They expected hesitation, confusion, or a childish mistake. But his movements were calm, purposeful, and confident. He didn't stop to think too long. He didn't erase or start over. His hand moved in a rhythm, building step after step, line after line, until the board began to fill with his calculations. The professor's smile began to fade slightly as he leaned forward. He tilted his head, watching more carefully. The graduate students stopped whispering and began to stare intently at the lines forming on the board. Something about the boy's approach looked different. It wasn't random. It wasn't childish. It was deliberate, clean, and surprisingly bold. The boy didn't notice the stares or the silence growing heavier around him. He was in his own world, following the path of numbers he had already worked out in his notebook. His little heart pounded, but his focus was sharp. Every number he wrote brought him closer to what he saw so clearly in his mind. The solution. The room, filled with some of the most intelligent adults in the world, now watched a 9-year-old write with confidence on the board that many had failed to master. The professor took a step closer, narrowing his eyes as he studied the boy's logic. His amusement had completely vanished, and still the boy kept writing. The boy's small hand moved steadily across the chalkboard, the piece of chalk scratching lightly as he filled the dark surface with symbols and numbers. At first, the audience thought it was just a playful attempt. Some whispered that maybe he would draw shapes or simply write something random to make people laugh. But soon the whispers stopped. His steps were too clean, his writing too purposeful. Each line seemed to lead directly into the next, like pieces of a hidden path only he could see. The boy did not pause to look around. His face was calm, his lips pressed together, his eyes fixed on the board as though he was having a quiet conversation with the numbers themselves. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't even trying to impress anyone. He was simply doing what felt natural to him, solving the puzzle that had been calling to him since the lecture began. Minutes ticked by, but no one noticed the time. The silence in the room grew heavier with every stroke of chalk. Graduate students who had once smirked were now leaning forward, their pens frozen above their notebooks. Professors who had been ready to dismiss him now stared with furrowed brows, trying to follow his logic. The air was so still that even the soft squeak of chalk seemed sharp, like music filling the space. The professor who had declared the problem impossible walked slowly closer to the board. His hands were folded behind his back and his expression had changed from amusement to curiosity. He leaned in, his eyes scanning each step. At first he expected to find a mistake, but the more he read, the more his surprise grew. The boy's method was not the same as the traditional approaches used by experts. He wasn't bound by the old rules or the invisible walls that others had built around the problem. He was moving with fresh eyes, following patterns that no one else had dared to see. The boy climbed higher onto the stool to reach the top corner of the board. His small fingers left faint chalk dust across his sleeves, but he didn't care. His heart pounded, but his hand never trembled. He was lost in the puzzle, his mind racing yet calm, guiding him to the finish. The audience held their breath. A few students exchanged glances, their faces pale with disbelief. A professor in the front row adjusted his glasses, his jaw tightening as he scribbled notes to keep up with the boy's work. Another professor leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "He's actually building a correct path." The colleague only shook his head in silence, unable to take his eyes off the child's work. After what felt like an eternity, the boy finally stopped. He placed the chalk down carefully on the edge of the board and turned around. His face was calm, his eyes wide but not boastful. He pointed to the final line of his work and said in a soft, simple voice, "That's the answer." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. No one moved. The boy stood on the stool looking out at rows of grown men and women waiting for a reaction. His sister, still in the back row, pressed her hands tightly against her mouth, her eyes shining with fear and pride all at once. She had thought he would embarrass himself. Now she wasn't sure what she was witnessing. The professor stepped closer to the board, his eyes narrowing as he traced the boy's steps line by line. He muttered softly to himself, following the logic, checking each detail. The other professors joined in, some moving to the edge of the stage to get a better view. They leaned toward the board, their heads nodding slightly as they realized what was happening. Then the professor turned to face the hall. His expression was not one of anger or dismissal. It was something far more serious. "This," he began, his voice almost shaking, "this is correct." The words echoed in the hall like a clap of thunder. Gasps spread across the room. Graduate students dropped their pens. Some professors leaned back in their chairs, stunned. The boy's sister felt her breath catch in her throat and tears welled up in her eyes. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. Her 9-year-old brother, the same boy who still played with toy blocks at home, had just solved something that the world's smartest minds had declared impossible. The professor turned back to the board, running his hand across his chin. "In all my years," he said slowly, "I have never seen anyone solve this problem, not even close. And today, before all of us, a 9-year-old child has done it." The hall erupted. Some people clapped loudly, standing up from their seats. Others shouted in disbelief, cheering as though they had just witnessed history. A few students rushed to the stage, their notebooks open, begging to copy down the boy's solution. The professors exchanged looks of amazement, some shaking their heads in wonder. The boy stood quietly on the stool, overwhelmed by the sudden noise. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. His cheeks turned red and he looked down at his sneakers. He hadn't come here for applause. He had only wanted to finish the puzzle in front of him. The professor turned toward him and knelt slightly so their eyes met. "How did you do this?" he asked gently. "What made you think of this approach?" The boy shrugged, his voice soft and innocent. "I just saw it differently." Those words, so simple and clear, hung in the air. They carried a weight that touched everyone in the room. The graduate students, the professors, the scholars, every one of them realized something important. The problem had not been unsolvable. It had only been seen through the same old eyes too many times. It took the fresh perspective of a child to notice the door where everyone else saw a wall. The applause grew louder, echoing off the tall walls of the Harvard Hall. People clapped until their hands stung, some even whistling, others shaking their heads in disbelief while smiling in admiration. The boy's sister wiped her tears and stood, clapping harder than anyone else. Her heart swelled with pride, though her mind was still trying to process what had happened. The boy stepped down from the stool carefully, clutching his notebook against his chest. Professors surrounded him, asking questions, pointing at his work, scribbling their own notes. Some asked about his school, his teachers, his methods. He only shrugged shyly, not fully understanding why everyone was so amazed. To him, it had been a simple puzzle, and yet, to the world, it was a miracle. The professor, who had once stood confidently before the hall declaring the problem impossible, now stood humbled by the quiet genius of a 9-year-old. He looked at the boy again, shaking his head with a smile. "Never underestimate the mind of a child," he said softly, though everyone in the room could hear him. The boy smiled faintly, not out of pride, but out of relief. The puzzle was complete, and that was enough for him. The hall was filled with noise now. The kind of noise that rises when people cannot believe what they have just seen. Students whispered in clusters, professors argued in low voices, and graduate researchers flipped through their notebooks, comparing the boy's solution to the failed attempts of the past. The boy himself stood quietly, clutching his notebook, his small frame looking almost lost among the tall adults who surrounded him. He had not come to impress them, yet here he was, the center of the storm. The professor who had claimed with such certainty that the problem was unsolvable stood silently, his hand on his chin, his eyes never leaving the chalkboard. His mind was racing, retracing every line of the boy's work. Each step made sense. Each piece fit together. There was no error. What unsettled him was not that the boy had succeeded, but that he had succeeded with such simplicity. It was as though the child had walked through a door that had been wide open all along, while the rest of the world had been too busy staring at the walls. He turned back toward the audience, his voice low but clear. "It is correct," he repeated firmly. "This boy has solved it." The sound of chairs scraping the floor filled the hall as more people rose to their feet, applauding. The clapping spread like a wave, and soon the entire room was on its feet cheering for the child. Some even whistled, others shouted words of praise. The applause went on, echoing against the high walls until the boy lowered his head shyly, his cheeks glowing pink. His sister rushed forward through the crowd. She grabbed his shoulders tightly, her eyes wet with tears. "Do you know what you've done?" she whispered, almost in disbelief. He gave her a puzzled smile, shrugging. "I just solved it," he said, as though it were the simplest thing in the world. She shook her head, pulling him into a hug, realizing that her little brother had just changed the way people thought about possibility itself. Meanwhile, professors began to surround the chalkboard. Some copied down his work, muttering to themselves. One of them pressed his glasses against his forehead, sighing. "We've been attacking this problem from the wrong direction," he admitted to a colleague. "The boy ignored our old rules and found a new path." Another nodded, looking both amazed and embarrassed. "It took a 9-year-old to show us," he whispered back. The main professor turned to the boy again. "Do you realize," he asked carefully, "what this means? You've done what entire conferences of experts could not." But the boy simply shook his head. His shoulders rose in a small shrug. "I don't know," he replied softly. "I just saw it." His honesty and innocence brought a ripple of laughter and admiration through the room. It was clear he had not acted for fame or recognition. He had acted out of curiosity, and that made his achievement even more powerful. The hall buzzed with questions now. Students raised their hands, asking how he had thought of his first step. Others wanted to know what inspired him, what tools he used. The boy's answers remained simple, almost childlike. "I played with the numbers in my head," he said. "I tried to see what they wanted to do." The simplicity of his explanation only deepened the wonder in the room. Professors who had spent decades trying to break the problem now realized that the boy's lack of fear or expectation had allowed him to see what they could not. As the applause settled, journalists who had been sitting quietly in the back began scribbling furiously. A few of them rushed out to call their editors. The story of a 9-year-old solving the impossible problem at Harvard would not stay hidden inside those walls for long. It would soon reach the newspapers, the radio, and eventually the world. The boy, however, seemed untouched by the thought of fame. He stepped down from the stool, brushing chalk dust from his hands, and went back to his sister. "Can we go home now?" he asked quietly, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. His sister laughed, tears still on her cheeks. "Not yet," she whispered, hugging him tightly. "The world isn't finished clapping for you." Around them, professors continued to debate, their voices rising with energy. Some discussed what this meant for mathematics as a whole. "It changes the field," one declared. "If a child can solve this, then our boundaries are not where we thought they were. We must rethink everything." Another professor added, "This is more than a solution. It is proof that we have been blind to new ways of thinking." The professor who had originally declared the problem impossible finally raised his hand, quieting the room. His voice was steady but softer than before. "Today we have learned a lesson greater than mathematics. We have learned that certainty is dangerous. When we call something impossible, we close our eyes to new possibilities. This boy has reminded us to stay open, to see the world through fresh eyes." He turned toward the boy with a deep bow of respect. The hall followed his example, the audience lowering their heads in admiration for the child. The boy shifted uncomfortably, not used to such gestures. He tugged at his sister's hand. "I just want to go play," he whispered. She smiled, knowing that her brother's innocence was what made the moment even more extraordinary. As the evening went on, more people approached him. Some asked for his autograph, others asked his sister about his schooling. She explained that he had always loved puzzles, that numbers fascinated him more than toys. While other children played video games, he would spend hours filling notebooks with strange symbols and experiments. She admitted that even she hadn't fully understood him until tonight. Now the world would. By the time they left the hall, the boy's solution had already begun to spread through whispers and phone calls. Professors promised to write papers, journalists promised to publish stories, and students promised to share what they had seen. The boy walked out quietly, holding his sister's hand, the sound of applause still ringing in his ears. For him, the puzzle was solved. For the world, the story was just beginning. In the days that followed, news of the event exploded across the country. Headlines in newspapers read, "9-year-old solves the impossible at Harvard." Radio stations told the story with excitement, and people everywhere debated how a child could see what experts could not. Some doubted it, claiming it was exaggerated. Others defended it passionately, pointing to the professors who had confirmed it with their own eyes. The boy's name began to appear everywhere, yet he stayed the same. He still went to school, still played with his friends, still doodled puzzles in his notebook. Fame didn't change his heart. He wasn't chasing recognition, he was chasing curiosity. But in Harvard's Grand Hall, the lesson he had given that day would stay forever in the memory of those who had witnessed it. That possibility lives where we least expect it, sometimes in the hands of a child. The story of the boy spread faster than anyone expected. By the next morning, Harvard's lecture hall was no longer just a place where students studied quietly. It had become the center of attention for newspapers, radio hosts, and curious onlookers who wanted to know more about the child who had done what everyone thought was impossible. Reporters rushed to interview the professors, and the professors confirmed with serious faces that yes, the boy's work was correct. A 9-year-old had walked into their hall and solved a puzzle that had challenged them for decades. Newspapers carried bold headlines. "The boy who solved the impossible. 9-year-old genius shocks Harvard." Radio announcers spoke with excitement, their voices filled with wonder. People in small towns, big cities, and even other countries heard the story and repeated it with awe. The world had found a new kind of hero. Not a movie star, not a famous athlete, but a child with a notebook and a curious mind. The boy, however, seemed untouched by all the noise. At home, he still lived the same life. He went to school, played with his friends, and asked his sister for help with ordinary things like tying his shoelaces or carrying heavy books. To him, solving the problem at Harvard was just like finishing a puzzle or a game. It had made sense in his head, so he wrote it down. He didn't understand why people were making such a big deal out of it. But for the professors, the event shook the very foundation of what they believed about learning and discovery. At Harvard and in universities around the world, teachers began to discuss what had happened. They talked about how they had declared something impossible, only to watch a child break that belief in front of them. Some admitted that they had become too rigid in their thinking, trapped in old ways. The boy had reminded them that curiosity and imagination could be more powerful than experience. The professor who had once stood on stage and told the audience the problem was unsolvable spoke differently now. In his later lectures, he often shared the story of that day. He would begin by writing the same equation on the board, then pause and smile before saying, "I once called this impossible, and then a child proved me wrong." His students always leaned forward in amazement, some even inspired to chase their own questions with fresh courage. Meanwhile, the boy's sister became his quiet protector. She knew the attention could overwhelm him. Reporters called, scientists wanted interviews, and schools wanted to give him awards. But she shielded him from most of it, reminding everyone that he was just 9 years old, still learning, still growing. At home, she watched him doodle numbers in his notebook while humming softly to himself. And she realized that his greatest gift was not the solution he had found, but the way he looked at the world. With wonder and without fear. Weeks turned into months, and the story continued to travel. People debated what it meant. Some said he was a genius, a prodigy unlike any other. Others said maybe he had been lucky, that perhaps the problem had simply needed someone with unusual instincts. But the truth was simple. He had solved it because he believed it could be solved. Where others saw a closed door, he had seen a door wide open. The boy's life remained simple. He still liked playing with toy blocks, still enjoyed riding his bicycle, and still asked endless questions at the dinner table. But teachers noticed a difference in the way people looked at him. Some treated him with awe, as if he were older than he really was. Others treated him with caution, not sure how to teach a boy who had outsmarted professors at Harvard. But the boy didn't worry about what others thought. He only cared about the next puzzle, the next question, the next chance to see the hidden patterns that others overlooked. The world, however, carried the lesson far and wide. In classrooms, teachers told their students, "Don't be afraid to try. Even if experts say something is impossible, you might see what they cannot." Parents told their children the story as bedtime inspiration, reminding them that age does not limit imagination. Even people who had no interest in mathematics found meaning in it. To them, the boy symbolized courage, curiosity, and the power of seeing the world differently. Years later, when people looked back, they remembered that day at Harvard not just as the day a problem was solved, but as the day pride gave way to humility. They remembered how a child had walked to the front of the hall, stood on a stool, and written with chalk while the most brilliant adults in the world held their breath. They remembered how silence turned into applause and how doubt turned into wonder. The boy himself rarely talked about it. If asked, he would shrug and say simply, "I just solved it." He never thought of himself as better than anyone else. He didn't carry arrogance, only curiosity. And perhaps that was the real reason he had been able to see what others could not. Because he wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing understanding. One evening, long after the noise of the world had quieted, his sister asked him if he knew how much he had changed people's lives. He looked up from his notebook and smiled softly. "I don't know," he said, "but I like it when numbers make sense. It feels like finding the right piece in a puzzle." She hugged him, realizing that his genius was wrapped in innocence, and that innocence was what made him truly remarkable. For Harvard, the memory of that day remained etched into history. Professors still told the story to new students, reminding them to stay humble, to never dismiss a question too quickly, and to always leave space for wonder. The stool the boy had stood on was quietly kept in the corner of the hall, a small reminder of the day when the impossible was solved by the hands of a child. The story lived on because it was more than mathematics. It was about the strength of curiosity, the courage to try, and the reminder that sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest truths. The boy didn't see himself as a hero, but to the world. He became one, the child who solved the impossible, and in doing so, taught everyone that impossibility is only a word, not a wall, and so his name became a quiet legend. Not because he wanted it, but because he showed the world that brilliance can shine at any age, in any place, and often when it is least expected.